Welcome to Behind the White Coat Conversations with Los Alamos Scientists. I'm your host, Carol A. Clark. I'm with the Los Alamos Daily Post newspaper here in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Tonight, my guest is Julian Chen. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk about his career, what he does at the laboratory, his background, and so forth. So, where were you born? Where did you go to school? What's your educational background?
Well, I'm originally from the West Coast. I'm from Oregon. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in fact. And I did my undergraduate work at Caltech in Pasadena, California, Southern California, and then went up to the Bay Area for graduate school at UC San Francisco. Stayed there for a postdoc, and then I began my career as an academic actually in Frankfurt, Germany, at Goethe University as an assistant professor.
Now, what is your degree in?
I got my undergraduate degree in chemistry, and then I did my graduate work in biophysics.
Biophysics.
Yeah.
And then you were a professor in Germany for 6 or 7 years?
6 years.
At what facility there, institution?
So it's called Goethe University in Frankfurt. That's the main university in Hessen, which is the state where
Yes.
Frankfurt is.
Are you fluent in German?
I wouldn't say I'm fluent, but I certainly got by.
And what led you to Los Alamos and Los Alamos National Laboratory?
Well, actually, in fact, Germany led me there. So I started at Los Alamos Labs as a user of the protein crystallography station, in fact. So this was back in 2005 in December. We had a project that we felt was suitable for the neutron source and neutron crystallography, which I guess I'll get into later on. Mm-hmm. And we worked with a guy named Paul Langen and Benno Schönborn, and I met lots of fantastic people at the labs. And
what division do you work in at the lab now?
So right now I'm in bioscience division, although I spend some of my time down at the Wuhan Center, which is where the neutron source is.
Yes. And could you talk about the relation, protein crystallography with pharmaceuticals, the relationship there?
So protein crystallography. So this is a technique that normally uses X-rays, or in this case, neutrons, to look at the structures of proteins. So you can imagine that, for example, you may have a protein that is very important for human health purposes. For example, proteins from HIV or influenza, or proteins that are involved in cancer, and we would like to know what their structure is. So if we want to design a drug or come up with some kind of pharmaceutical or treatment against the disease, we can perhaps specifically target that particular molecule.
I see.
So, for example, one of the best known examples are the drugs people use to treat HIV. So, for example, protease inhibitors, which you may have heard of, and reverse transcriptase inhibitors, they all interact with with specific proteins in HIV at specific points in the viral life cycle. And so structural biology provides us a tool to actually look at these structures and optimize and design better drugs against these proteins.
And in the years that you've been working at the lab in this field, have there been any breakthroughs, or are you close to breakthroughs?
So, for example, in HIV, this is something I did as a postdoctoral fellow in San Francisco. We solved the structure, the X-ray structure in this case, of one of the enzymatic targets for HIV, which is called integrase. And at that time, it was the one of the first structures of integrase to be published. This was back in 2000. And I think back in 2009, they finally had a FDA drug that was approved targeting integrase. So it's really just the beginning of a very, very long and sometimes arduous path towards getting a pharmaceutical approved for human use. Mm-hmm.
But boy, when you do, what a great help to
Yeah,
society.
and I would say that was one of the more satisfying aspects of my career. Seeing that this was able to, I think, help in a small way get towards a pharmaceutical.
Is that kind of what led you into this field, the aspect of being able to kind of find, discover ways to help people that are sick?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. But I think I was also influenced by the just beauty of protein structures. They're artistically very pretty to look at. There's wonderful symmetry, and I deal with protein crystals, which are in and of itself quite beautiful as well to look at under the microscope, and they're really wonderful, wonderful objects. So it's also the aesthetic aspect of it, I think.
And you mentioned the neutron facility here. What did you do when you were over there? Or do you still work there sometimes?
At the neutron facility.
Yes.
So the neutrons give us a insight into protein structure, but in a very slightly different way than X-ray crystallography. So X-ray crystallography gives us the structures of all the major elements in proteins, which are carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur. And the missing ingredient here is hydrogen. Now, that's the most common element in the universe. It's also the most common element in proteins, but we hardly ever see them. So the properties of neutrons allow us to more accurately place where hydrogens are, and these hydrogens are, of course, quite important for function and for chemical reactions and for enzymatic reactions. So we'd like to know where they are and what they're doing. And that's really why we use neutron crystallography as a tool.
I see. And I can kind of see your nature as a professor come out when you explain some of these things, that you're very good at explaining the different elements here. So could you kind of give us a comparison of science in Germany compared to science in the US? How you found the differences and the similarities?
Well, there are many similarities, of course. You do have to, you attack a certain problem that you're interested in, and I think science fundamentally is done pretty much the same around the world. And I had to do, of course, the same kinds of things in Germany, which is teach, raise money for research, apply for grants. But there are, of course, subtle differences, and I think that there are probably some cultural influences that make science somewhat different in Germany as opposed to the United States. But I think it's somewhat difficult to elaborate on that.
And would you recommend people do scientific research in different countries? In other words, people here in the U.S., would you recommend that they take the experience of going to another country to kind of work on science?
I think it's generally it's a good thing in life in general. I think not just science, but it's really trying to diversify and get a feeling for how things are done in other countries. Of course, you get used to the typical routines of American life, and you're in for a shock. I think most people are in for a shock when they go to Europe, even though, of course, many things are quite similar. You still have to go grocery shopping, you still have to drive an automobile or take a train, you still have to get around, you still have to deal with the tasks of daily life, and they are somewhat different in Europe.
And when you were young, did you just as it kind of always feel like you wanted to go into the field of science, or was there a particular experienced teacher? Are either of your parents in science? Kind of what led you into going into science?
Well, actually, I think it was actually the NASA stuff. The space probes that went by Jupiter and Saturn and Neptune and Uranus, and the pictures from Viking in the 1970s when the landers came to Mars. I think that's what got me most interested. Also, Carl Sagan's Cosmos. So I think that really tells us about the right kind of publicity and the right kind of images can do for people's curiosity about science. Same with the space program and people sending astronauts into space and landing a man on the moon. These things were really, truly very meaningful events in human history. And I think that we need more of those kinds of things to stimulate people's curiosity about science. A good example would be these rovers on Mars. For example, Opportunity, which has been there for 10 years, and then the more recent Curiosity and their landing sequence and how they were able to get a very heavy vehicle on the surface of the planet and shoot these wonderful pictures.
Have you had a chance to go into downtown Los Alamos? We have a facility there where the the scientists are really working with other locations, France and other places, all on the Mars rover. Have you been in that facility?
I have not.
It's quite something to see.
I'll have to visit sometime.
Yes. Roger Wien's the kind of the head of the program.
Okay.
Works out of that office.
And he's a Los Alamos scientist?
Yes, he
Okay.
is. Yes, he is. He's written a book on the project and has spoken quite a few locations. And so if you get a chance, go down there. And it's in a room in the community programs office off of Central Avenue.
All right.
So could you take us through kind of a typical day at work for you when you arrive? Kind of, there's probably no typical day, but just in general terms.
Yeah, I mean, there is no typical day. In fact, I guess the typical day is still being made in a way, because I just started this position literally on Monday.
Oh.
But before that, I was a visiting scientist, and I was, I suppose, spared some of the meetings and other events. So actually, during the first 4 months I was here, I was able to work in the lab pretty much every day. So I would come in and take care of daily and weekly protein preparations, because that's what you need to do for protein crystallography. You need to get your sample first, purify your sample. So I spent a fair amount of time doing that. More recently, of course, now I have the responsibility of also raising money and writing for grants, and so that's involved more meetings with people and other staff members here to try to come up with projects and stories to tell and things to investigate.
And is your family involved in science, either of your parents, or?
No.
You're the first in the family to go into the field of science?
In my immediate family, yes.
And do you have, what types of hobbies do you have?
Well, I try to get around as much as possible. So I really enjoy traveling. In fact, after I finished my time in Germany, I spent some time and traveled around the US. I drove across country, in fact, and also went to various places in Eastern Europe, Georgia, Armenia, Romania, and I really enjoy traveling around. I also enjoy the outdoors, so this is really a pretty nice place, I have to admit. Great outdoors, great scenery. I like snowboarding. I play the piano, do other things like that. So plenty to do.
I have found in my years of interviewing scientists how often they are musicians or they are in the arts in some way. And you just mentioned you play the piano.
I do, yes.
And the laboratory director, Charlie McMillan, is also, he plays the piano, he plays the other instruments, he acts, he dances, he sings, and it's just amazing how there's something that goes hand in hand with science and the arts.
So you should introduce me to him someday. Perhaps we can get together and make some music.
He does play in a quartet, by the way.
Okay.
Yes.
Fantastic. I'm looking for people to play with.
Okay. Well, I'll pass that on. So what else can we talk about as far as your work that you'd like to kind of share with our viewers? Particular projects or anything that you might want to share with?
Well, I guess I can give you an idea of what we need to do a neutron crystallography experiment. So
Great.
we typically need an amount of protein that will make a sufficient sample. So neutron crystallography is still a rather difficult technique because you have very, very demanding sample requirements. You need very, very big crystals. So by very big, it's not something the size of my finger, but rather it's something perhaps about 1/3 of the size of my finger, about 1 to 5 millimeters in the largest dimension. And so the reason you need that is because these neutrons, you don't get too many neutrons. And neutrons tend to regard everything else as being primarily transparent. They only interact with the atomic nucleus. And so it's actually very hard to interact with the atomic nucleus because the atomic nucleus is very, very, very tiny. So if you imagine an atom, and if you imagine that the electron cloud, which is what X-rays interact with, let's say that's the size of a stadium, a football stadium, the nucleus would be something the size of a pinhead in the middle of the stadium. So your chance of an interaction between a neutron and a nucleus is pretty low. And so this kind of endeavor, neutron crystallography, takes a lot of time. It is a real significant investment in money and labor. And to date, there are not that many neutron structures out there. So we have about 100,000 protein structures that have been solved and deposited in a database. And there are only about 65 neutron structures out of them. And the PCS at Los Alamos is responsible for about half of them.
Wow.
It's one of the most amazing instruments around, really.
And then who's responsible for about the other half?
Other sources around the world, this includes sources in Japan, Grenoble, France. There's one that recently opened in Munich. There's one under construction in Sweden. There's one that has been recently commissioned at Oak Ridge National Labs.
And then do you and your division, do you all collaborate with these other entities, or?
Well, it's a very small world, and we're good friends, in fact. Paul Langen used to be at the lab, used to be at Los Alamos, and he recently moved to Oak Ridge, so we stay in touch, and I think it's still a scientific discipline that's driven by trying to progress the entire field rather than competition between various groups. So that's something that also drew me to neutron crystallography.
And just to get an idea about how many individuals work on your team or in your group or division.
So right now in the laboratory that I work in, there are 5 people in the lab. I think there's 2 postdocs, Zoe Fisher, who's an instrument scientist, and 1 post-bac student. So it's a relatively small group. The Wuhan Center is somewhat larger. I think it's on the order of about 50 people or so.
We just have a couple of minutes left, and I always kind of like to end the interviews because we have a lot of students that watch the program. And I asked the scientists and I would like to ask you if you would perhaps just kind of share with our student viewers why it's so interesting to go into science and what they might do to help, if they're in high school, for example, to kind of help them kind of select the field that they might want to go into.
Why is it important to be a scientist? And why select science? I would.
Why it's so interesting, and why you find it so interesting.
Well, I would say it's probably most important to study what you love to do. And if it's not science, if it's history or philosophy or architecture or music, by all means study architecture or music. So I don't think I'm not going to go so far as to encourage everybody to do science.
Right. But if they do kind of have a leaning towards it, what might help them along their way?
Stay curious. I say travel and look around. Go to different places. Go outside of New Mexico or even outside the U.S. I think that will give you plenty of things to discover and to be curious about.
Okay.
Look up in the sky through a telescope. There's a lot of wonderful stuff out there. It just needs to be explored, and perhaps something will catch your eye and command your attention.
Great. Well, that's good advice, and I've really enjoyed the interview. Julian Chen, thank you so much for being a guest on
You're very
Behind
welcome.
the White Coat.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time on Behind the White Coat, Conversations with Los Alamos Scientists.
Science. E equals MC squared.